Okay, I've listed just a couple of example research questions here on this slide. And a second ago I said that I typically think that good research questions don't have yes or no answers. And these I've written, again, they're just examples, but I've written them in such a way that that they actually don't have yes or no answers. So let me give you an example of the first one here. What are the consequences of school tardiness? This actually, if you think back to last week's material, this would actually be a good exploratory question. We don't really have any expectations about what those consequences are, but we're just doing some research to figure out what it is they are. The next, the bullet point below that, I actually think is a slight improvement of that school tardiness research question. I'll read it for you real quick. What effect does tardiness have on academic performance? This might be something more like an explanatory research question. Again, drawing or sort of tying back to the information that we talked about last week. The third one that I've listed just a little bit lower on the page there, that question is what is the effect of a caregiver intervention on school tardiness? This might be a good example of an evaluative research question. So these questions are focused, right? They list the social problem, tardiness or school tardiness, and they actually would have social benefit as well. Would they have scientific relevance? Potentially, especially if we were discovering or thinking we might discover some new consequences to school tardiness that people really hadn't thought of yet. So the next step really in the research process after identifying a topic is starting to conduct a lit review. So this is week 3, I think. I don't have my syllabus in front of me, but I think somewhere around week 5, we're actually going to hear about the library from the librarian. So we'll actually circle back to lit reviews there as well. So really, in a lit review, you're starting to gather information that's already been written or studies that have already been published about your particular topic. So you're looking for what information already exists, what kinds of questions have been answered already, and then ideally, what you're trying to find are gaps in the literature about the problem or topic. And in an ideal world, our research questions would fill the gaps in the literature about that particular topic. A hypothesis is really nothing more than an informed hunch about what the relationship between variables will be. Let me say, so think back to some of the stuff that we talked about last week. We talked about 4 different purposes of research: descriptive, exploratory, explanatory, and evaluative. Typically, there are no hypotheses in descriptive and exploratory research. There are, generally speaking, hypotheses are only found in explanatory work and in evaluative work. So we could think of an example hypothesis here based on some of the questions, the example questions that I had listed a few slides ago. One of the questions I wrote, what is the effect of school tardiness on academic performance? And a reasonable hunch about the relationship between those two variables, school tardiness and academic performance, a reasonable hunch would be that there's a negative relationship. So the more often a person is late to school, the lower we would expect their academic performance to be. The other example question that I posed a few slides ago had to do with the effects of an intervention on school tardiness. And so a reasonable hypothesis in an evaluative study might be something to the effect of, we hypothesize, or I hypothesize, that a parent intervention or a caregiver intervention would reduce tardiness among among school children. Hypotheses, they typically include the same language as what you've used in a research question. It's okay to use the names of variables again in those hypotheses, but they're also based on previous research, what's been done. They can be based on practice experiences as well. That's particularly true for people who are asking questions about, say, mental health treatment or social policy work, kinds of things that social workers are involved in pretty regularly. Okay, so here's a couple of examples of different hypotheses. As self-esteem decreases, binge drinking increases. Again, we've referenced variables, we've referenced a relationship between those variables. And if you wanted to practice developing a research question, you actually could pause the video here and take a look. You could sort of reverse engineer the research question from which these hypotheses were generated. I won't give you answers to the hypotheses that are listed second, third, and fourth here, but I'll give you a research question or example research question for that first one. As self-esteem decreases, binge drinking increases. So a good explanatory research question for that hypothesis might be something like, what is the effect of self-esteem on binge drinking? So we've talked about a vocabulary word, or we've used a term here that I actually think is a pretty important vocabulary term, and that word really is variable. Research is often really about relationships between variables, and a variable is really nothing more than, that slide should say characteristic or property, not of property, characteristic or property, that can vary. That simply means that a characteristic could take on different values or different attributes. Just about anything can be a variable, and I've listed some examples right there: poverty rate, homelessness, race, gender, religious affiliation, religious preference, substance use, smoking status, age, right? All of these things are variables. We'll actually circle around, I think, next week and talk more about different types of variables. We're gonna introduce those today, but we'll circle back to them as well. So, two special cases of variables. Oops, went too far. The first is an independent variable. An independent variable exerts an effect on a dependent variable. One of the ways to remember this, I use a mnemonic device. Independent variable starts with an I, and intervention also starts with an I. So just as an independent variable exerts an effect on a dependent variable, an intervention would be intended to change some kind of dependent variable. Let's talk about a dependent variable, and then I'll fill in with some examples. A dependent variable is often called an outcome variable. It is often the problem that we're studying, so that social problem that we're studying, and it's quite honestly a variable that can be changed based on other variables, such as independent variables. So let me give you some examples real quick. I said a second ago that intervention starts with I, so does independent variable. It's a good way to remember them. So let me give you a very basic example real quick. Cognitive behavioral therapy would be an independent variable, and that would have an effect on, let's say, depression. That would be a dependent variable. That would be a problem. So it would be the cognitive behavioral therapy that's impacting a person's level of depression. Let's see, I'll give you another example here. School tardiness. So using the example from a couple of slides ago, again, school tardiness would be the dependent variable, but some kind of caregiver intervention would be an independent variable, again, we've used I in both intervention and independent variable. Now, think about that other example I said a couple of slides ago. The explanatory question that I proposed, that I listed as an example, was what's the effect of school tardiness on academic achievement, or GPA, something like that. In that case, we're sort of switching the dependent variable, and we're making school tardiness the independent variable, and we're making academic performance the independent variable. So just because something's a dependent variable once doesn't mean that it always is, but it typically has to do with the position the variable is listed in the research question. This can be tough, but if you spend a few minutes thinking about it, you can get it, and there's some exercises on UB Learns to help you think through some of these things this week. All right, here's a couple of other examples. We might want to impact a person's comfort with information and communication technologies, and so an independent variable would be participating in a training program. Honestly, a training program is very much like an intervention, right? Maybe you're sitting down and you're teaching people about computer skills or a particular program or something like that, and we would measure their comfort with a particular information technology or something like that. Another example, poverty rate. Sorry about that. I think there was an awkward pause there. Had to change something on the slide real quick. So here's another example. Homelessness might be a good dependent variable. Again, that's a sort of good social problem. It's a classic social problem in which social workers are involved. But poverty is something that impacts homelessness. So again, you're thinking about independent variable, dependent variable. Okay. Oops. So here's a chance for you to test this out yourself. I've listed a hypothesis. Let me read it to you. The well-being of abused children placed with relatives will be better than the well-being of those placed in non-relative foster care. What's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? The dependent variable is well-being. Well-being. The independent variable would be where the children are placed. Okay? Relative foster care or foster care, or a non-relative foster care. Okay, here's the answer. Right? Independent variable is the type of placement. Dependent variable is well-being. We can do another example real quick. So the hypothesis again, the lower an adult's income is, the more likely they will report medication non-adherence due to cost. So what is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? I'll give you a second to think about it. We'll go on to the next slide here. The independent variable is income, and the dependent variable would be non-adherence, medication non-adherence. I said a second ago that sometimes dependent variables can become independent variables depending on where they're placed in the hypothesis and in the research question. So like I said, I'll reiterate it. Just because a variable is a dependent variable once doesn't mean that it always is. So here's a good example of how variables can be sort of switched around to be both independent variables and dependent variables. So the hypothesis is, the more years of education an individual has, the higher her or his income will be. In this example, the dependent variable is income, and the independent variable would be years of education. But if we switch that hypothesis around, we can see that the DV and the IV will switch around. And that's what's listed there in that final bullet point. So the higher an individual's income, the more years of education